Orson Vale didn't even look up from his ledger when he said it. He just pushed those 3 coins back across the counter with one finger, slow, deliberate, like he was returning something dirty, and let his eyes travel up and down. Delphine Harrow's body, the way a man looks at livestock he's already decided, isn't worth buying. Looks to me, he said, loud enough for every person in that store to hear. Like you've eaten enough already. The laughter came fast. It always did in Coldwater Gap, when someone decided a large woman was the joke of the afternoon. A ranch hand near the tobacco shelf nearly choked. A woman in a blue bonnet pressed her hand to her mouth, not to hide her disgust, but to hide her smile. Dell stood at that counter and did not move for 3 full seconds. She had not eaten a real meal in 2 days. If this story already has you hooked, you're exactly where you belong. Subscribe to this channel right now so you never miss what happens next. Stories like this one drop every week, and trust me, you don't want to be the last one to know how it ends. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Dell, because what happens next at that hitching rail will change everything. The flour she needed was nothing extraordinary. 5 pounds, maybe 6. A small block of salt pork. A spool of heavy thread for the canvas work she'd promised the Baylor brothers by Friday. 3 items. She had calculated it exactly against the coins left in the handkerchief she kept pinned inside her coat pocket, the coins she'd been holding for 2 weeks. Rationing against the landlord's voice that came through her door every Tuesday morning like a debt collector's drumbeat. She hadn't asked for charity. She had asked for credit, which was different, because credit meant she intended to pay, and she always paid, every single time, even when it meant skipping her own supper so a customer got their mended shirt back on the day she promised. Orson Vale knew that. He'd taken her money before. He'd taken it a dozen times. But today there was an audience, and Orson Vale was the kind of man who required an audience to feel tall. Dell picked up her 3 coins. She closed her fingers around them, turned and walked toward the door with her back straight and her chin level, because the one thing she had decided years ago, the one rule she had made for herself, and never once broken, was that she would not let this town see her fall apart. She made it to the door. She made it through it. She made it all the way to the hitching rail out front before her body decided it had held enough. Her hand found the rail. Her knees, which had been threatening to buckle since somewhere around the flour barrel, finally stopped cooperating. She gripped the wood hard enough to feel the grain of it against her palm, and she stood there in the brutal August heat of Coldwater Gap's Main Street, staring at the packed dirt between her shoes, while the humiliation and the hunger and the pure exhausted weight of the last 2 days pressed down on her all at once. She was not a woman who cried easily. She'd had her jaw set against it since she was 11 years old, and her stepmother told her she ate too much, and her father didn't disagree. 28 years of practice. 28 years of learning to swallow the kind of pain that other people handed you like it was a gift. Like your reaction to it was the problem and not the cruelty itself. But her eyes were burning now, and her throat hurt, and the 3 coins in her fist were the only 3 coins she had in the world. And she was so hungry her hands had been shaking since morning. The wagon coming up the street barely registered until it stopped. She didn't look up. She assumed it was passing. She assumed everything about the next 30 seconds would be the same as the 30 seconds before it. Anonymous, unremarkable. Another moment in the long, unbroken string of moments she had survived alone. Then a voice said, "You all right?" It wasn't a gentle voice. It wasn't the kind of voice that asked questions softly, the way people sometimes did when they were performing concern for an audience. It was flat and a little rough and entirely without decoration, and it came from somewhere above her, from someone still seated on a wagon bench. And when Dell finally looked up, she saw a man she recognized by reputation, even though they'd never spoken. Silas Creed. She knew the name the way everyone in and around Coldwater Gap knew it in pieces, through other people's mouths. Mountain man. Cattle rancher. Keeps to himself up at Iron Pine, that spread 2,000 feet above town, that nobody visited twice unless invited. 40, maybe 41. She'd seen him in town before, always alone, always moving like a man who had somewhere specific to be and no patience for anything that stood between him and getting there. He was looking at her now with an expression that wasn't pity. Exactly. It was closer to the look a man gets when he witnesses something he considers an injustice and hasn't decided yet what he intends to do about it. I'm fine, Dell said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. She was grateful for that, at least. Silas Creed did not appear to find this convincing. He set the brake on his wagon, which was not a thing a man in a hurry did, and he climbed down from the bench with the particular unhurried deliberateness of someone who had already made a decision and was simply in the process of carrying it out. Inside, he said, I heard. Dell felt the heat come into her face, not from the sun. Then you heard me handle it. I heard a man make a fool of himself at your expense. He stopped a few feet away from her. Up close, he was bigger than she'd registered from a distance. Not in a threatening way, but in the way of someone who had spent decades doing hard physical work in difficult country. And I heard you walk out without giving him anything worth laughing about. She looked at him directly. That's my business. It is, he agreed, without any argument in it. Then he turned and walked back into the general store. Dell stared after him. She didn't know what she expected. She didn't know what she wanted him to do, given that she'd just told him it was her business, and she was fine. She was not fine, but that was beside the point. The point was she hadn't asked for anything from Silas Creed or anyone else, and she didn't intend to start. She straightened up from the hitching rail. She was thinking about the walk home 40 minutes down the eastern road into the heat, without the flour or the salt pork or the thread when Silas came back out. He was carrying a crate. She could see the flour from where she stood, and the salt pork, and a paper-wrapped package that looked like it contained considerably more than she'd asked for. What is that? Dell said. Supplies. I can see that. Why do you have them? He set the crate on the back of his wagon with the ease of a man accustomed to moving heavy things. Because you needed them, and Orson Vale is an idiot. Dell felt something tighten in her chest, the complicated, uncomfortable feeling of being helped when you'd spent years building a self that didn't need help. I don't take charity, Mr. Creed. He turned around and looked at her for a moment. Then his eyes dropped briefly to the sewing kit she had tucked under her left arm, the worn leather case she carried everywhere. The one with the good scissors and the 3 grades of needle, and the collection of thread she'd built up over 5 years of careful work. That a sewing kit, he said? Yes. You any good? The question caught her off guard, which was probably why she answered it honestly. I'm the best seamstress in this county and 2 counties over. Something shifted in his expression. It might have been the beginning of a smile. I've got saddlebags falling apart, canvas packs that need restitching, winter tack that should have been repaired 6 months ago. He leaned against the wagon's side. Wouldn't be charity if you worked for it. Dell looked at the crate on the back of his wagon. She looked at her 3 coins.
She thought about the Baylor Brothers canvas work and the 40-minute walk home and the shaking in her hands that she'd been pretending wasn't there since 8 that morning.
What's the rate? She said. He named a figure. It was fair more than fair, actually. It was the kind of rate that acknowledged the skill involved, rather than the desperation of the person doing it. All right, she said. I'll need my supplies delivered to my address first. Then I'll come up to your ranch when... I'm headed up now, he said. You can ride along and start today if you're willing. I can walk. It's 9 miles up the mountain. I know where Iron Pine is. He didn't argue with her. He simply waited, which turned out to be more effective than arguing, because while she was standing there preparing to reiterate that she was perfectly capable of walking 9 miles up a mountain road. In August heat, after 2 days of near starvation, her knees made their opinion known. It was subtle. Just a brief, traitorous softening, the kind that happens when a body has been pushed past what it can sustain on stubbornness alone. Caught herself, grabbed the hitching rail again, and for one awful moment the whole careful architecture of her composure tilted. Silas moved before she'd finished registering that she was falling. He was close enough that it only took 2 steps, and his hand found her elbow with a grip that was firm without being rough, steadying rather than grabbing. And Dell found herself upright again, without having made the decision to accept help. She pulled her arm back as soon as she was certain her knees would hold. Thank you, she said, because not saying it would have been absurd. He didn't make anything of it. He didn't look alarmed, or satisfied, or knowing. He just said, the wagon's right here, and went around to the bench side like the matter was settled. It wasn't settled. Dell stood at the hitching rail for another 4 or 5 seconds, running the kind of internal argument with herself that she'd gotten very good at over the years. The argument, the part of her that had learned to manage alone, and the part of her that was 28 years old and hungry and had been white-knuckling it since sunrise. Then she walked around to the passenger side of the wagon and climbed up. Silas didn't comment on this. He released the brake. The wagon started moving. Coldwater Gap's Main Street slid past them, the barber shop, the land office, the milliner's window, with its display of summer bonnets. Dell sat with her sewing kit on her lap, and her 3 coins still in her coat pocket and her eyes forward, watching the town give way to the road that wound north and then sharply up toward the mountains. She became aware, somewhere around the edge of town, that she was not actually as fine as she'd told Silas Creed she was. The shaking in her hands had spread. It was in her arms now, a low, persistent tremor she was managing by keeping her hands clasped together in her lap, fingers interlocked. The heat wasn't helping. Neither was the way the road started to tilt upward. Silas reached under the bench and produced something wrapped in cloth. He set it on the seat between them without comment. Dell looked at it. "Bread and dried beef," he said. "From this morning. I was going to eat it on the road." "I'm not hungry," she said. He said nothing. The wagon went around a long bend. A stand of pine trees closed over the road and dropped the temperature by something you could actually feel. Dell looked at the cloth-wrapped food on the seat. She unwrapped it. She ate it. She ate it with the particular care of someone who was very hungry, but did not want to appear very hungry. And she kept her eyes on the road ahead, and Silas kept his eyes on the road ahead, and neither of them said anything about it. By the time the food was gone, some of the trembling in her hands had quieted. "Better?" Silas said without looking at her. "I told you I wasn't." "Better," he said again. It wasn't a question this time. It was just a statement, like he was noting the weather. Dell pressed her lips together. "Yes," she said. "Better." The mountain road was steep in sections, and Silas's horses were good, strong, steady animals that took the grade without complaint. Dell found herself watching them, the way their muscles moved and their ears swiveled, because watching the horses gave her something to do that wasn't thinking about Orson Vale's face or the laughter or the 3 coins still sitting in her pocket. "How long have you had iron pine?" she said after a while. Talking felt safer than thinking. 12 years. And the cattle? Started with 20 head, running about 200 now. She did the math on that without meaning to the kind of automatic calculation she'd always done, fitting numbers against time and labor and market value. That's a good rate of growth for mountain country. He glanced at her sideways. "It is. What's your winter loss been like?" "Worse than I'd like. Better than some years." "You running Shorthorns?" "Mix. Some Longhorn crosses." She nodded. She was thinking about the timber accounts she'd seen him arguing over at the land office once, 2 summers ago. She was thinking about whether she'd imagined the numbers being off, or whether they'd actually been off. But that was none of her business, and she hadn't been invited to his ranch to audit his books. She'd been invited to fix his tack. The road leveled briefly on a wide shelf of mountain, and then the trees thinned and Iron Pine Ranch came into view. Dell had expected rough. She had expected isolated. She had expected a working ranch with a working ranch's particular kind of organized disorder. What she hadn't expected was how the main house sat against the mountain like it had grown there, low and long, built from local timber that had weathered to silver gray, porch that ran the full width of the front, and a view down the valley that, in better circumstances, she might have called beautiful. It wasn't elegant, but it had a solidity to it, a sense that whoever built it had been thinking about permanence. "You built this?" she said. "Most of it, yourself. Had help for the heavy lifting." She took in the barn, the outbuildings, the fencing that ran in careful lines down the slope, the vegetable garden on the south side of the house that was clearly being managed by someone who understood growing things but didn't have enough time for it, the water trough near the barn that sat at a slight angle she could see from here. Something in her brain was already cataloging, already noting. She told it to stop. Silas pulled the wagon up near the barn and set the brake. "Saddlebags are in there," he said, nodding at the barn. "Canvas packs on the west wall. I'll show you the winter tack in a minute." He climbed down, then paused. "There's a room in the house. It's not much, but if the work takes a few days, you're welcome to it instead of riding back down to town each evening." Dell looked at him. He held up a hand, brief and matter-of-fact. "There's no one else at the ranch. You'd have the house to yourself nights. I sleep in the bunk room off the barn when I've got work that runs late, which is most nights this time of year." He said it the way a man presents information rather than the way a man makes a case. "I'm not suggesting anything other than what I said." Dell thought about her room in town. The landlord's knock on Tuesday mornings. The 40-minute walk down a mountain road. I'll look at the saddlebags first, she said. Then we'll see about the room. They went into the barn. The saddlebags were worse than she'd expected, not neglected exactly, but repaired by someone with more determination than technique. The stitching on the main body had been redone at least twice with the wrong thread weight, which meant the seams had held, but the leather around them had started to stress and crack. Dell sat down on a hay bale and opened the first one across her lap. She ran her thumb along the failing seam, feeling where the damage started, calculating how far back she'd need to take it. These have been patched before, she said. 3 times. Kept coming apart, because whoever patched them used harness thread on saddlebag leather. These need something lighter on the upper seams and heavier where it attaches to the saddle. She turned it over. I'll need to take this section apart and redo it properly. It'll take longer, but it won't come apart again. Silas leaned against the barn wall, watching her. How long for all of it? She looked around at the canvas packs on the west wall, the bridles hanging in various states of need, the pile of winter gear that had been deposited in the corner and presumably forgotten until today. If I work straight through 3 days, maybe 4. I can pay you for 4. I said maybe 4. I'll try for 3. He almost smiled. She was learning to recognize the particular stillness around his mouth that preceded it. She started working. The barn was warm but not unbearable, and the rhythm of the work unpicking, assessing, cutting, stitching settled her the way it always did. Her hands stopped shaking entirely somewhere in the middle of the first saddlebag. Her breathing leveled out. The morning's humiliation didn't disappear, but it moved back, the way pain does when you give your mind something else to hold. Silas came and went. He was moving cattle in the lower pasture, she gathered, based on the sounds of it. He checked on her twice in the afternoon, once to bring water, once to ask if she needed additional materials from a supply box he kept in the tack room. It was on the second check that she noticed the ledger. It was sitting on a shelf near the tack room door open, face down, the way a book gets left when someone is called away from it in a hurry. She wouldn't have looked at it if a page hadn't slipped when Silas moved the supply box, sending the ledger sideways so the open pages faced up. She wasn't trying to read it, but she was close, and the columns were large, and she was very good with numbers. 2 things registered before she looked away. The entries were 6 months behind, and the timber payment recorded in the most recent column was wrong. Not by much, but it was wrong in a specific, deliberate-looking way that she recognized. She turned back to the saddlebag she was working on. She did not say anything, but the number stayed in her head, sitting there like a splinter. At supper, which Silas made without ceremony and placed on the table without fanfare, a serviceable meal of beef stew and biscuits, that was better than she'd expected, and that she ate without pretending she wasn't hungry, Dell made the calculation again. She'd seen the number twice now, held it long enough to be sure she wasn't misremembering. The timber rate he'd been paid was lower than the county market rate by nearly 15%. 15%, over what looked like at least 2 years. She thought about saying something. She thought about the fact that she'd been here less than 12 hours, that she'd been hired to fix leather goods, and not to poke around in a man's financial records. That Silas Creed had already done her a considerable kindness today, and possibly the least she could do was not immediately start commenting on the management of his business. She ate her biscuit. The vegetable garden, she said instead. South side of the house. What about it? You've got squash going soft on the vine. He set down his fork. I know, you don't have time to preserve them before they go. I know that too. I can preserve them, she said. If you have salt and a few jars. It wouldn't take long. I could do it in the mornings before I start on the tack. He looked at her for a moment. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to. I'm offering. He picked up his fork again. There's salt in the pantry. Jars in the cellar. He said it the way he said most things, flat, without excess. But there was something in it that wasn't nothing. Thank you. Dell nodded. She looked out the kitchen window at the garden, visible in the last of the evening light. Your water trough is sitting uneven, she said. Foundation shifted in the spring thaw. If it keeps sitting that way, the near seam is going to crack before winter. A brief pause. I know. It'd take a couple of hours to level the foundation stones. Silas put down his fork again and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not annoyed, exactly. More like a man confronting something he hadn't anticipated. You want to level my water trough, he said. I'm pointing out that it needs doing. You've been here 8 hours. I know what I've been here for. She met his eyes. I'm also telling you things I can see. You can decide what to do with them. He looked at her for another moment. Then he picked up his fork. The bunk room is available, he said. If you want to stay and work tomorrow. I said I'd think about the room. You've been thinking about it for 8 hours. Dell looked at her stew. She had in fact been thinking about it for 8 hours. Stay, she said. But I want my rate adjusted for the trough work. That's not leather repair. Fair, he said. They finished supper in the kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, the quiet of two people who are accustomed to their own company and haven't yet decided what to do with someone else's. Dell washed the dishes. Silas went back to the barn. She took the room he'd offered, which was small and plain, and had a window that looked east toward where the valley dropped away. And she lay on the narrow bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about the timber payment and the ledger and what 15% over 2 years added up to. It added up to a number that made her jaw set. She wasn't going to say anything yet. She needed to be sure, but she was going to be sure. She had planned to stay 3 days. She stayed 2 weeks. Not because she ran out of work, though the work expanded. Every day she looked at the ranch with the particular attention she brought to anything she'd decided to understand fully. Not even because she kept finding new things to fix, though she did, systematically, from the water trough foundation to the bent hinge on the cellar door to the inventory system in the tack room that had apparently never existed and clearly needed to. She stayed because Iron Pine was the first place in her adult life where she woke up in the morning without spending 20 minutes preparing herself to walk outside. Couldn't have explained it precisely, and she didn't try. It was something to do with the way Silas Creed moved through the day with her in it without once treating her body as a subject. He didn't comment on what she ate or how much. He didn't avoid standing next to her or position himself in ways that telegraphed discomfort. He didn't look at her with the particular brand of distant sympathy that was almost worse than open mockery, because at least mockery was honest. He watched her work. He watched her the way he watched the horses, and the weather, and the cattle moving through the lower pasture with the attentive assessment of someone cataloging real information. On the 3rd day, he pulled a fence line that had been strung poorly and asked her to hand him tools while he restrung it. On the 5th day, when a summer storm came through, faster than either of them expected, they spent 40 minutes in the barn together moving hay bales off a wet section of floor, and he matched his pace to hers without making a thing of it. On the 9th day, he asked her to look at the account books. He didn't explain why he was asking. He just pulled them out after supper and set them in front of her with the look of a man who had made a decision and was slightly uncertain how it would be received. You already saw them, he said, that first night. Dell didn't deny it. What did you notice, he said. She thought about being careful. Then she thought about the fact that Silas Creed had fed her when she was hungry and offered her work when she needed it, and hadn't once made her feel like either of those things required her gratitude to take a specific shape. Your timber payment is off, she said, by about 15%. He went very still. Off how? Low. Against the county market rate. She turned the ledger to face him and pointed to the column. This is what Caldwell Timber paid you per 100 board feet. This is what the county posted as the going rate for that quarter. She had memorized both numbers without meaning to, which was what happened when Dell's brain found something that didn't add up. The difference over 2 years is around $430. Silas stared at the numbers for a long moment. I thought the rate varied by access, he said. Mountain land, winter delivery problems. It varies some, Dell said. But not by 15%. Not consistently. She kept her voice even. This isn't variability. This is a fixed reduction. Same differential, quarter after quarter. His jaw had tightened. She could see it. You're certain. I'd want to compare against independent survey records to be completely certain. But yes, I'm fairly certain. He stood up from the table and walked to the window. He stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides, looking out at the dark. Caldwell Timber is half owned by Bramwell Lock, he said. You know who that is? Dell did. Everyone around Coldwater Gap knew who Bramwell Lock was. He was the kind of man whose name came up in conversations the way weather came up, as a condition you dealt with rather than a person you argued with. I know who he is, she said. Silas turned around from the window. His expression had settled into something flat and certain, the look of a man who has just been handed a piece of information that explains a longer history than the immediate conversation. "There's more I need to tell you," he said, "about why I came to this valley." Dell folded her hands on the table. She waited. He sat down across from her and told her about Wyoming Territory, about the homesteaders and the land fraud, and the man who went to prison and the man who didn't. He told it without drama, in the same flat, careful voice he used for everything. But Dell listened to what was underneath the flatness, the particular weight of someone describing an old injustice that had followed them to a new place. When he finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the wind working through the pine trees outside. "You think Locke knows who you are," Dell said. "I think he's known since the day I bought this land. And the timber payments. A way to bleed iron pine without touching me directly." He looked at his hands on the table. "Or so I expect." Dell looked at the account books. She looked at the 12 years of careful work recorded in them, the 20 head of cattle that had become 200, the fencing and the building and the grinding daily effort of keeping a mountain ranch alive. She thought about Tabitha Crane, the elderly widow who lived down the South Road, who Dell knew from town as a woman who apologized constantly for everything, who moved through the world with the particular exhausted shame of someone who has spent years being convinced that their own poverty is their own fault. She thought about how many names might be in ledgers she hadn't seen yet. "We need the independent survey records," she said. Silas looked at her. You can't do this alone. You've got a cattle operation to run and a corrupt timber company to fight and apparently a powerful enemy who's had 12 years to prepare." She said it practically, the way she said most things. "You need someone to handle the account work. That's what I do." A long silence. "Dell," he said, and his voice had a quality to it she hadn't heard before, not soft, exactly, but careful. "You understand what you're walking into." "I understand what I'm already in," she said. "Because I've been staying on this ranch for 9 days, and presumably Coldwater Gap has noticed." He said nothing. "They've already decided what the story is," she said, "whatever it is. So I don't have a reputation here left to protect by leaving." She kept her eyes on the ledger. "And the work needs doing." Silas Creed was quiet for a very long time. Then he said, "The survey office opens at 8. "I know," said Dell. Turned to the ledger page and started making notes. The survey office opened at 8, and Dell was there at 7:55. She had the ledger numbers written out on 2 sheets of paper in her neat, compressed handwriting not copied from Silas's books directly, because she hadn't wanted to remove them from the ranch, but reconstructed from memory, which for Dell was effectively the same thing. She had her columns organized by quarter, by rate, by volume, with the county posted rates written alongside each entry in a different hand, so the comparison was immediate and clear. The clerk at the survey office was a young man named Petty, who looked like he'd been behind that desk for approximately 3 weeks and was still learning which drawer the stamps lived in. He found Dell's request for independent timber survey records slightly confusing, then slightly alarming, then finally just bureaucratically complicated, which resulted in 20 minutes of searching before he produced a ledger of his own that was dusty enough to suggest it didn't get consulted often. Dell sat at the counter and went through it page by page. She found what she was looking for in 11 minutes. The numbers were worse than she'd calculated, not 15%, closer to 18 in some quarters. And the pattern didn't start 2 years ago, it started 4 years ago, which meant the underpayment to Iron Pine alone was significantly larger than what she'd estimated at the kitchen table the night before. She wrote down everything. She thanked Petty, who seemed relieved to have her leave, and she walked back out onto Coldwater Gap's Main Street in the morning light with her papers held flat against her chest and her mind already 3 steps ahead. Silas was waiting with the wagon on the far side of the street. He'd come down for supplies and stayed, she understood, to see how the survey office went. He watched her cross toward him with the particular attention he brought to anything that mattered. When she climbed up beside him, she handed him the comparison sheet without preamble. He looked at it for a long moment. 4 years, he said. At least 4. The records before that are inconsistent. Looks like the filing system changed, so I couldn't make a clean comparison on the earlier quarters. But 4 years certain. 4 years certain. She took the paper back before the morning wind could catch it. That's not variability, Silas. That's not mountain access pricing or seasonal rate adjustment. That's a fixed margin being skimmed off the top every single quarter, consistently enough that someone had to be maintaining it deliberately. He was quiet. The horse at the hitching post shifted its weight and blew out a breath. Tabitha Crane, he said. Dell had been thinking about Tabitha Crane since approximately the moment she found the 4-year pattern. She runs timber out of the South Ridge. Caldwell would be her most accessible buyer. She's been struggling for years. She thinks it's her management. I know. Dell folded the papers carefully. I'd like to look at her accounts. Silas turned to look at her. She's not going to hand her account books to a stranger. She might hand them to someone who explains what I found in yours. Dell, I'm not going to frighten her, Dell said, with a firmness that wasn't defensive, just precise. I've watched a woman apologize for existing for long enough that I know exactly how to have that conversation. Silas held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the street. She lives off the South Road, he said, about 4 miles down. I know where she lives. He almost said something else. She could tell by the slight tension around his mouth, the look of a man who has more words available than he's choosing to use. In the 2 weeks she'd been at Iron Pine, she had gotten good at reading that specific expression. I'll be back before supper, she said. If you're worried. I didn't say I was worried. You have the face you get when you're deciding whether to say something you've already decided not to say. Tension around his mouth shifted into something that was definitely not a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. Go talk to Tabitha, he said. Dell went. Tabitha Crane was 63 years old and had the careful, slightly braced posture of someone who had learned to expect that most conversations would end with her, owing something she hadn't anticipated. She came to her door with flour on her hands and wariness in her eyes, and she looked at Dell the way people in small valleys look at anyone who shows up unannounced with the specific suspicion of someone who has learned that unexpected visitors usually want something. Mrs. Crane, Dell said. My name is Delphine Harrow. I'm doing account work for Silas Creed up at Iron Pine. I found something in his timber records that I think you should see. Tabitha Crane looked at her for a long moment. You're the woman staying up at Iron Pine, she said. Yes. People are talking about that. I expect they are, Dell said. Do you want to see what I found or not? Tabitha stepped back from the door. They sat at Tabitha's kitchen table, with the old woman's account books, spread between them 3 years of careful, apologetic handwriting that recorded every transaction with the particular thoroughness of someone who blamed themselves for the results, and had decided documentation was the only defense against their own failures. Took Dell 40 minutes to go through them. When she finished, she set down her pencil and looked at Tabitha, who had been sitting across from her the whole time with her hands folded on the table and an expression of someone waiting for already expected to be bad. Mrs. Crane, Dell said, you have been underpaid by Caldwell Timber for at least 3 years. Tabitha's hands tightened on each other. I don't think. I'm not guessing. I've got the county survey rates right here. Dell turned her comparison sheet around and set it in front of the old woman. This is what Caldwell paid you per 100 board feet. This is the posted county rate for the same period. The difference, totaled across 3 years, is approximately $310. The kitchen was very quiet. Tabitha Crane looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she looked up, and Dell saw something in her face that she recognized because she had seen it in her own face in the mirror on bad mornings, the expression of someone realizing that the story they'd been telling themselves about their own failures was not the true story. $310, Tabitha said. Her voice had gone strange. Not loud, quieter if anything. I spent 2 years cutting back. Selling stock. I thought I wasn't managing right. You were managing fine, Dell said. Someone was stealing from you. The old woman put one hand over her mouth. Dell waited. She didn't try to say anything else, because there wasn't anything else to say, and she understood that what Tabitha needed in this moment was not more information, but simply the space to absorb the information she'd already been given. After a minute, Tabitha Crane lowered her hand. What do we do? She said. Dell had already been thinking about that on the 4-mile ride down the South Road. First, I need to understand how many other landowners in this valley are selling timber through Caldwell. Then I need to know whether the underpayment pattern is consistent across all of them, or specific to certain properties. Why would it be specific? Because if Locke is targeting certain properties, smaller ones, isolated ones, operated by people he assumes won't check the math that tells us something about the purpose. Del folded her comparison sheet and put it in her coat pocket. And if it's everyone, that tells us something different. Tabitha looked at her steadily. You think it's everyone. I think a man like Bramwell Locke doesn't build a system like this for 2 ranches. Silence. I know 4 families on the South Road who sell through Caldwell, Tabitha said slowly. The Mercer place, Old Fen Dobbins, the Astor widow over on the creek, and the Hallorans. She paused. None of them have anyone to look at their books. Would they let me? Tabitha looked at her for a long moment. The wariness from the doorstep was gone. In its place was something more careful and more serious, the look of a woman who has just been shown that the thing she thought was her fault was not her fault, and is now deciding what to do with that information. If I come with you, Tabitha said, they'll listen. Del nodded. Then come with me. It took 3 days. 3 days of kitchens and kitchen tables and account books, with varying degrees of organization, and 3 days of Del sitting across from people who had spent years apologizing for their own poverty, while Tabitha sat beside her and said, quietly, I thought it was my fault too. That part mattered more than Del had expected. Tabitha's voice in those conversations, not Del's analysis, not the numbers on the comparison sheet, but the particular weight of one struggling person saying to another, I thought the same thing. That was what opened the doors. That was what got the account books brought out from the drawers where they'd been kept, with the particular shame of documents you look at infrequently because looking at them hurts. Pattern was consistent. Every property, every quarter, the same differential, applied with the same deliberate precision. Del sat in Silas's kitchen on the evening of the 3rd day with 6 sets of account records spread across the table and added up the total underpayment across all of them. She wrote the number down. She looked at it for a moment. Then she turned it so Silas could see it. He looked at the number. His jaw tightened in the way she'd learned to read as his version of an expression most people would show on their whole face. That's just the timber, she said. I haven't looked at grazing lease rates or water rights agreements yet. There are grazing leases too, he said. It wasn't a question. Almost certainly, she put her pencil down. Silas, this is a federal land fraud case. This isn't something that gets resolved at the county level. Locke has people at the county level. That's how the rates have stayed consistent for years without anyone official noticing. Quiet for a moment. The federal land office in the territorial capital. Yes, that's a 2-day ride. I know. And we'd need independent surveyor testimony to support the account records. Otherwise, it's our numbers against his lawyers. Del had already thought about this. There's a surveyor in Millhaven. Everett Shaw, I've heard his name from the Mercer family. They said he's honest. I know Everett, Silas said. He is. Then we need to talk to him. Silas leaned back in his chair. He was looking at the account records on the table, and Del could see him doing the same kind of assessment she'd been doing for 3 days. Not just counting the money, but counting the people. The Mercer family with their 2 sons trying to save enough to buy more land. Old Fen Dobbins, who was 71 and had been selling timber to pay a doctor's bill for 2 years. The Astor widow. The Hallorans. Tabitha Crane, who had sold stock she couldn't afford to lose because she believed the poverty was her failure. I grew up in a valley not that different from this one, Silas said. He said it quietly, looking at the table. In Wyoming. Before Iron Pine. He paused. I watched my father lose land he'd worked 20 years to build because he didn't understand the contract he'd signed. By the time he understood it, it was too late. He looked up at her. I should have caught this sooner. You're running 200 cattle on a mountain ranch by yourself, Del said. You don't have time to audit your own accounts quarterly. That's not a character failure, Silas. That's just one person and too many hours in a day. I still should have. And I should have eaten something other than weak tea for 2 days before I walked into Orson Vale's store, Del said. We should all do a lot of things. What matters is what we do now. He looked at her across the table. Something shifted in that look, not a dramatic shift, not a sudden visible thing, but a change in quality. The careful assessor's attention she'd gotten used to from him, which had always felt respectful and a little formal, had something in it now that was less formal and harder to categorize. She didn't try to categorize it. She looked back at the account records. I'll send a message to Everett Shaw in the morning, she said. I'll ride to Millhaven myself, Silas said. I know him. It'll go faster. Del nodded. While you're gone, I'll start organizing the documentation. Everything needs to be presented in a way the Federal Land Office can follow. Without our explanation, they need to be able to see the pattern themselves. That's going to take a while. I work quickly. He said nothing for a moment. Then, you should take the larger room. Dell looked up from the account books. I'm fine in the room I have. The larger room has a proper desk. You're going to be sitting at a kitchen table for 3 days, organizing federal evidence. You should have a desk. She looked at him. He said it without anything in it except practical same way he'd said most things to her, flat and direct and without decoration. But she was aware, suddenly, of the particular quality of attention that came from being the kind of person someone reorganizes their house around. All right, she said. The larger room. Silas left for Millhaven the next morning before 7. Dell moved into the larger room and found the desk he'd mentioned, solid pine, worn smooth on the top from years of use, with 3 drawers on the right side that contained, in order, a broken compass, 40 feet of carefully coiled twine, and a photograph. She didn't mean to look at the photograph. She had opened the drawer looking for ink. It was a small photograph, slightly faded, mounted on stiff cardstock the way portrait photographs were. A woman with a calm face and dark eyes, and beside her a small girl 3 years old, maybe 4, with her father's serious expression and her mother's eyes. Dell closed the drawer carefully. She found ink in the left side. She set up her papers. She started work. She worked for 2 days straight, with breaks for meals and a few hours of sleep each night, and by the time Silas returned with Everett Shaw in tow, she had produced a documentation package that laid out the fraud with the kind of clarity that comes from someone who has spent years making complicated things simple for people who needed to understand them. Everett Shaw was a compact, precise man in his 50s, with the particular combination of confidence and exactness that Dell associated with people who were very good at a technical skill and had spent years defending that skill's importance. He sat across from her at the pine desk and went through her documentation for an hour without speaking. When he finished, he looked up. "Who trained you?" he said. "No one," Dell said. "I trained myself." He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked back at the documentation. "This is better organized than most of what I see from professional land agents." "Thank you. I'm not flattering you," he said. "I'm telling you this will work." He tapped the top sheet. "With my survey certification attached to this analysis, the Federal Land Office will have enough to open a formal investigation." Dell felt something ease in her chest, not relief exactly, but the quiet settling of a long tension. "How long will certification take?" "I've got the survey instruments. I'll need a week on the ground, cross-referencing the properties." He glanced at Silas. "You'll cover my costs?" "Yes," Silas said. "Then I'll start tomorrow morning." That evening, the 3 of them at the kitchen table with supper, and the comfortable particular tiredness of people who have been working towards something and can finally see the shape of it, Dell became aware that Coldwater Gap was watching. She became aware of it because a note arrived. Not a letter, nothing with a name attached. A folded piece of paper left under the front door of Iron Pine's main house, which meant someone had ridden up the mountain specifically to deliver it. Dell unfolded it. She read it once. Then she set it on the table where Silas could see it. He read it. His expression didn't change much, but the stillness that settled over him was different from his usual stillness, heavier, more deliberate. The note was unsigned. It said, "Creed has enemies he hasn't told you about. Leave Iron Pine before you find out why." Everett Shaw, who had seen the note from across the table, said, "Locke knows we're moving. He's known something was moving since I went to the survey office," Dell said. She was looking at the note calmly, turning it over in her hands. "He's been watching this ranch. How long?" Silas said. His voice was flat, but it had a specific quality to it, not anger exactly, but the particular tension of someone who has put something he values in a position of risk. "Long enough," Dell said. She set the note down. "Silas, I need you to tell me the rest of it." He looked at her. "Whatever you haven't told me yet about Wyoming Territory," she said. "Part you've been deciding whether to say." A silence. Everett Shaw looked between them and then quietly found something to look at in the other direction. Silas was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "The man who went to prison in Wyoming. His name was Cutter. He had a partner, the financial backing behind the operation. That partner was never charged. The case against him wasn't strong enough. The evidence didn't connect directly, and his lawyers were better than the territory's prosecutors. He folded his hands on the table. When I came to Coldwater Gap, I didn't know Locke was here. I was just looking for mountain land, isolated enough to. He stopped. I bought Iron Pine without knowing who controlled the timber operation in this valley. But he knew who you were, Dell said. Once I was here, yes. I think he knew within a year. And instead of running you out, he started skimming your timber payments. He's a patient man, Silas said. He'd rather bleed a ranch slowly than create a legal situation that might bring federal attention to the valley. A pause. Until now. Until now, Dell agreed. She looked at the note again. She turned it over and looked at the blank side. He made a mistake, she said. The note says his enemies. It means to frighten me into thinking your past makes you a dangerous person to be around. She set the note down again. But what it actually tells me is that he'd rather I left than stayed. Which means he's more concerned about what I might do than about what you might do. Silas looked at her steadily. Dell, I know, if you leave. I'm not leaving, she said. There was no drama in it. No raised voice. No visible defiance. Just the flat matter-of-fact certainty of someone stating something that has already been decided. Everett needs a week to certify the surveys. I need another 3 days to finish the documentation package. After that, someone needs to carry everything to the federal land office in the territorial capital. She looked at the note. And I think it's becoming clear that it needs to be someone Locke hasn't yet identified as a threat. Everett looked back at the table. You, he said. Silas can't leave the ranch. If he disappears for 4 days, Locke will know what's happening. She looked at Silas. Can you get me a good horse? Something moved in Silas's face. Not the expression she'd expected, not agreement, or even conflict. Something quieter than either of those things, and more complicated. Yes, he said. I can get you a good horse. He was looking at her in the way he sometimes looked at the mountains, like something he was trying to hold the whole shape of and finding it too large for one look. Picked up the note and folded it again. Don't tell Tabitha yet. I don't want her worried before the surveys are finished. All right? And the other families same. They've been carrying fear long enough. Let them have a few more days of not knowing. Silas started and then he stopped. Dell looked at him. What? Nothing, he said. But the word had a quality to it, not dismissal. More like the word had been exchanged for something he decided to keep instead. Dell stood up and began collecting the documentation pages from the table. She stacked them carefully, aligned the edges, set them in the order she'd established. Go get some sleep, she said. Both of you. Tomorrow Everett starts on the south properties, and I'll finish the first section of the federal submission. Everett Shaw stood up from the table, with the cooperative compliance of a man who has been organized by son and found it reasonable. He said goodnight and took himself off to the spare room Dell had set up for him. Silas stayed at the table. He was quiet for long enough that Dell finally looked up from her stacking. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. When I first saw you outside that store, he said, you were holding that hitching rail like it was the only thing keeping you upright, and you still wouldn't let anyone see it. He paused. I've known a lot of people who were proud. You're not proud. You're something else. I'm not sure what to call it. Dell looked at him. She was aware of several things simultaneously. The lamplight, the account books on the table, the photograph in the closed drawer of the desk in the other room, the 10 years between their ages, particular vulnerability of being seen clearly by someone whose opinion had started to matter to you before you'd had a chance to decide whether that was something you wanted. Stubborn, she said. The word you're looking for is stubborn. He almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a real smile she'd seen from him. Get some sleep, she said again. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. He stood up. He said good night, which was more words than he usually offered at the end of an evening. He went to the barn. Dell sat alone at the table for a few minutes after he was gone. She picked up the threatening note and looked at it one more time. Then she set it face down and weighted it with the inkwell, and she turned back to her documentation. Outside, the pines moved in the night wind, and somewhere down in the dark valley, Bramwell Locke was making calculations she intended to make wrong. Everett Shaw spent 7 days on the ground. He rode the south properties in a methodical grid, measuring, marking, recording the particular focused labor of a man who understood that the value of his work lived entirely in its precision. Dell watched him leave each morning before sunrise and return each evening with his field notes, his cramped, careful handwriting. And each evening she took those notes and worked them into the documentation package, growing on the pine desk in the larger room. The work was consuming in the way that suited her best, the kind that left no room in the mind for anything except the problem directly in front of you. She organized the survey certifications chronologically, then cross-referenced them against the Caldwell timber payment records, then built a summary table that a federal investigator with no knowledge of this valley could read in 20 minutes and understand completely. She made 2 copies of everything, one for the federal land office, one to stay at Iron Pine, hidden in the cellar behind the salt jars, because she had been thinking about the threatening note since the night it arrived, and she was not someone who prepared for only the outcome she wanted. Silas moved around her work without disturbing it. He brought meals and coffee, checked on Everett's progress, handled the cattle operation with the focused efficiency of a man trying to keep 2 complicated things running simultaneously. He didn't ask how the documentation was going. He seemed to understand that if there was something she needed to tell him, she would tell him, and that asking her for progress would be the kind of thing that annoyed her without helping either of them. She appreciated that about him more than she could easily say. On the 5th evening of Everett's survey work, a second note appeared. Not under the door this time. Under a stone on the porch step, more deliberate, more exposed. Someone had been close enough to the house to place it quietly, which meant they'd come up the mountain road without the horses making noise. Or they'd come through the tree line on foot, which was a significant effort and suggested a significant purpose. Dell found it when she went out for water before breakfast. She read it standing on the porch in the early gray light. This one was shorter than the first. It said, "Last warning. Take what you're owed and go. We both know you don't belong here." Turned it over. Blank on the back. The handwriting was different from the first note, more educated, more controlled. Not the same person writing then. Someone with more polish delivering the same message. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket and went back inside and made breakfast. Silas came in from the barn an hour later and found her at the stove. He looked at her face and said, "What happened?" Another note. She handed it to him. He read it. The stillness that came over him was the particular kind she'd learned to distinguish from his ordinary stillness. This one had an edge to it, something held very carefully in check. "We both know you don't belong here," he said. His voice was quiet but had something underneath it. Specific. "He's talking to me now," Dell said. "Not to you." She took the note back and laid it on the table. "The first note was a warning about your past. This one is aimed at what I might already think about myself." She looked at it. He did research. He knows about Coldwater Gap. He knows about the store. Silas looked at her. "Dell, it doesn't work," she said. "What he's trying." She said it without bravado, flat and factual, the same way she said everything that was actually important. "Because I've been told I don't belong somewhere my entire life, and I'm still here." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When do you want to leave for the capital?" "The day after Everett finishes. I need 1 day to assemble the final package." She turned back to the stove. "Sit down. Breakfast is ready." He sat down. They ate without saying much, which was how most of their mornings went, not the silence of people who had run out of things to say, but the silence of people who had learned that not every thought needed to be spoken to be shared. Dell had not anticipated this about him. She had expected, when she first rode up to Iron Pine, that a man who lived alone in the mountains would be difficult to be around, closed in some fundamental way, or odd from the isolation, or both. Instead, she had found someone who was simply economical. He used words the way he used tools for specific purposes, without waste. She was aware, eating breakfast at his kitchen table in the early light, that this was the 3rd week she had been here. She was also aware, with the same clarity she brought to numbers that didn't add up, that she had stopped thinking about leaving. That was a problem she wasn't ready to look at directly yet. She set it to the side the way she set any variable she couldn't yet solve, noted, labeled, returned to later. Everett came back from the field on the 7th day with a complete set of survey certifications and an expression that sat somewhere between professional satisfaction and genuine anger. He sat down at the table and laid out his field notes. "It's all 6 properties," he said. "And it's not just the per-unit rate. There are volume discrepancies." He turned one of the sheets to face them. Caldwell's own purchase records show lower volumes than the stump counts on 3 of the properties, which means they were undercounting the timber they took, in addition to underpaying for what they reported. Dell looked at the numbers. That's a separate charge, she said. From the rate manipulation, yes. Everett tapped the sheet. The rate fraud is a civil matter restitution, regulatory penalty. But shorting the volume counts while maintaining the timber contracts is closer to outright theft of property. He paused. Which means this case is stronger than we thought. How much stronger, Silas said. Stronger, Everett said. Locke isn't just looking at fines and back payments. If the federal land office takes this up and the volume fraud can be demonstrated, and I can demonstrate it, he's looking at charges that carry prison time. Kitchen was quiet for a moment. Dell felt something shift in her chest. Not satisfaction, something more complicated. She thought about the photograph in the desk drawer. She thought about Wyoming territory and the man who'd escaped consequences the first time. How quickly can you have the certifications finalized? She said. 2 days. I'll have the complete federal submission ready in 2. She looked at Silas. I'll leave the morning of day 3. Silas nodded. He was looking at Everett's field notes, but Dell had the sense he was also looking at something further away, some private calculation she wasn't part of. That evening, after Everett retired, Silas asked her to sit on the porch. This was unusual. They didn't do porch sitting. It was a specific kind of ease she hadn't expected from him. And when she came outside and found him there with 2 cups of coffee in the cooling August night, she understood that he wanted to say something and had chosen the location deliberately. She sat. She took the coffee. He was quiet for a while. The valley was spread out below them in the dark. The lights of Coldwater Gap, a small cluster far down the mountain, and the sky above the peaks had that particular enormous quality it got on clear nights. Too much space. Too much dark, stars too bright and too numerous. My wife's name was Clara, he said. Dell didn't say anything. She held her coffee. She was from Pennsylvania originally. She came out west with her parents when she was 16, and I met her in Cheyenne when she was 22. He looked at the valley. She had a way of making any place she was in feel like it had always been arranged for her. Like she walked into rooms and they made sense. A pause. Our daughter's name was Maisie. She was 4. Dell sat with this. Fever came through in 81, he said. It was fast. Clara went first, and then Maisie 3 days later, and he stopped. He set his coffee cup on the porch railing and looked at it for a moment. I came here because there was nothing left in Wyoming, and I needed to put enough distance between myself and everything I'd lost that I could get up in the morning, without it being the first thing I thought of. He looked at the valley. Didn't entirely work, but it helped. I know, Dell said. She said it softly. I'm telling you because the note said we both know you don't belong here. He turned to look at her. And I want you to know that whoever wrote that is wrong about at least one thing. You belong here, not because I need someone to fix my attack or organize my accounts. Because Iron Pine has been quieter than I wanted, for longer than I admitted. And then you came and argued with me about my water trough in the 3rd hour we knew each other, and somehow that was... He stopped again. He was not a man who lost words easily. This clearly cost him something. I'm not explaining it well. You're explaining it fine, Dell said. He looked at her. She looked at the valley. When I was 17, she said, my stepmother told me I would never marry because no man would want a woman built the way I was. She said it practically, like she was doing me a favor by telling me early. She turned the coffee cup in her hands. I believed her for a long time. I built a life that assumed she was right small, contained, careful. A life where what I wanted didn't take up much space. She paused. I'm telling you that so you understand what it means that I've been on this ranch for 3 weeks, and I haven't spent a single morning preparing myself to walk outside. Silas was very still. That's he started. I'm not telling you to make it complicated, she said. I'm telling you because you told me something true, and I thought you deserved something true back. She stood up. And because in 2 days I'm leaving for the territorial capital, and I thought you should know, in case anything goes sideways on that road, that these 3 weeks meant something to me. She went back inside before he could respond. She lay in bed for a long time afterward, staring at the ceiling and thinking about whether she'd said too much or too little or precisely enough. She didn't arrive at a conclusion. She fell asleep somewhere in the middle of still deciding. The next morning was business. She was at the desk before 6 with the final documentation spread across the entire surface. Organizing it into the specific sequence she'd determined would present the strongest possible case survey certifications first, then the comparative rate analysis. then the volume discrepancy evidence, then the individual property records with Everett's field notes attached to each. She wrote a cover summary of 11 pages that laid out the fraud in clear, plain language, with the total underpayment figure and the total volume theft estimate in the first paragraph. Because she'd learned from watching people read complex documents that most of them decided in the first paragraph whether they were going to take it seriously. Silas appeared at the desk door with coffee at 7 and set it beside her without interrupting her work. Everett appeared at 8 with his finalized certifications. By noon, she had everything assembled. She was checking the page order on the second copy of the complete package when she heard horses. Not one horse, multiple, coming up the mountain road at a pace that wasn't casual. Silas heard it too. She could tell by the way the house went quiet, not that it had been loud, but there was a change in the air that happened when Silas Creed focused himself on something. She heard him step out onto the porch. She kept her hands on the documentation and kept her breathing even. Everett appeared in the doorway of the room. How many? I can't tell yet, Dell said. 3 men came up the road. They stopped in the yard below the porch. Dell moved to the window and looked at them, 2 broad men she didn't know, in the clothes of ranch hands, but with the particular way of holding themselves, she associated with men who were paid for something other than cattle work, and between them, a 3rd man she'd seen before. Harlan Bly, one of Locke's property managers. She'd seen his name in several of the contract documents she'd analyzed. He was the one with the polished handwriting. She'd looked at enough documents in the last 10 days to make that particular identification with confidence. She heard Silas's voice from the porch, flat and unhurried. Bly. Mr. Creed. Bly's voice was pleasant in the way that was designed to suggest he was doing everyone a favor. Nice morning. Mind if we step down? Say what you came to say from there. A brief pause. Mr. Locke wanted me to convey his concern about some account inquiries being made on behalf of local landowners. He thought it might be worth a conversation before this went anywhere. It didn't need to go. It's already gone where it needs to go, Silas said. Dell moved away from the window. She looked at Everett. She said, very quietly, take the second copy of the package and go out the back. Take it to your saddlebag and keep it there. Everett looked at her for exactly 1 second. Then he took the second copy from the desk and left the room. She heard the back door. She picked up the first copy and held it flat against her chest and walked out to the porch. The 3 men in the yard took her in. One of the large ones said something under his breath to the other. Bly's eyes went to the papers she was holding and stayed there. Miss Harrow, he said. His pleasant voice had adjusted slightly. I'm glad you're here. Mr. Locke has a proposal that specifically involves you. I'm listening, Dell said. He's prepared to offer you a settlement for your assistance on behalf of Iron Pine, a fair sum, enough to purchase a house in Coldwater Gap or wherever you might prefer to relocate. In addition, he'd cover your moving costs and any outstanding debts with local merchants. In exchange for what? Dell said. For those records. He nodded at the papers in her arms. All copies, and an agreement that this matter is closed. Dell looked at him. She thought briefly about the morning in Coldwater Gap's general store. Coins pushed back across the counter. The laughter. The hitching rail. She thought about Tabitha Crane's hands folded on her kitchen table and the sound of her voice saying $310. She thought about old Fen Dobbins, who was 71, and had been selling assets he couldn't replace to pay a bill he shouldn't have owed. No, she said. Bly's pleasantness dropped by a degree. Miss Harrow, you're a practical woman. Consider your position. You're a seamstress, staying on another man's ranch with no legal standing in any of these property disputes. You have no claim here. You've done considerable work on behalf of people who can't compensate you. Mr. Locke is offering real money for a clean resolution. I said no. The documents you're holding have already been copied, Dell said, and the copy is not on this property. A silence. Bly looked at her for a long moment. The pleasantness was mostly gone now. Miss Harrow, you're making a serious mistake. The serious mistake, Dell said, was underpaying 6 families in this valley for 4 years and assuming none of them would ever have anyone look at the numbers. She held the papers steadily. Mr. Locke has been operating on the assumption that the people he was stealing from were too isolated or too ignorant or too ashamed to fight back. She looked at Bly without blinking. He was wrong. One of the large men shifted. Silas took one step forward on the porch, which was not a large movement, but had a specific quality, the movement of someone repositioning themselves between something and the thing they intended to protect. Bly raised a hand slightly, and the large man went still. "You're going to regret this," Bly said. It was said without the pleasant tone. Just the plain statement. "Probably," Dell said. "Most worth doing comes with regret attached." Bly held her gaze for another moment. Then he turned his horse and the three of them rode back down the mountain. Dell stood on the porch until they were out of sight. Then she sat down on the porch steps. Because her legs had been shaking the entire time, and she'd been managing it by standing very still, and she could stop managing it now. Silas sat down beside her. Not close, a foot of space between them, appropriate space, but there. "Everett has the second copy," she said. "I heard you send him." "Good." She put the first copy down on the step beside her. Her hands were unsteady. She looked at them. "I hate that they do that." "Do what?" "My hands, after." She pressed them flat on her knees. "When it's happening, I'm fine. Afterward, they shake, and there's nothing I can do about it." Silas looked at her hands on her knees. He didn't say anything about them. He said, "You told them. The copy was off the property before you knew whether Everett had made it." "Yes. That was a gamble. I was reasonably certain he'd understand what I meant quickly enough. Reasonably certain. I'm not in the business of certainties," Dell said. "I work with the best available information." He was quiet for a moment. "He's going to come at this differently now," Silas said. "Bly coming up here directly, that was lock testing, whether you could be bought. Now he knows you can't." His voice was careful. "He'll use legal means next. Or what looks like legal means. I know. He has connections at the county level, the land records office, possibly the magistrate. I know that too. Dell." He said her name with the particular weight it sometimes had when he was choosing to use it deliberately. "I need you to tell me you understand what you're walking into if you carry that documentation to the territorial capital." Turned to look at him. He was looking at her with the expression she'd seen on the porch the night he told her about Clara and Maisie, not afraid. Exactly. But with the specific alertness of someone who has lost things before and has not finished learning how to manage the possibility of losing more. "I understand it," she said. "These aren't men who lose gracefully." "Silas." She said his name back at him, equally deliberate. "You saved me when I couldn't buy supper. You gave me work when I needed it, and a roof when I needed that. And you never once made me feel like either of those things required my gratitude to take a particular shape." She held his gaze. "You didn't save me, so I'd spend it of my life hiding behind you." He said nothing. His jaw was tight. "I am taking these papers to the territorial capital," she said. "I am going to find the federal land office, and I am going to place this documentation in the hands of whoever can act on it. And then I am coming back." She stood up from the porch step. "You can either spend the time I'm gone trusting that, or you can spend it worrying. But the outcome's the same either way." She picked up the documentation and went back inside. She heard him sit on the porch for another few minutes. Then she heard him stand up and walk toward the barn, which meant he was going to work, which meant he had decided to trust it. That mattered to her more than she would have known how to say out loud. The next morning was preparation. She was up at 5. She checked the documentation for the last time, verified the organization, satisfied herself that a federal investigator encountering it cold would follow it without confusion. She packed a saddlebag with what she needed for a 2-day ride she'd been borrowing from Silas's supplies for 3 weeks, and it was a slightly strange feeling, packing to leave a place that had stopped feeling borrowed. Breakfast, something happened that she hadn't anticipated. A third document arrived. Not a threatening note this time. A formal legal notice, delivered by a county official, a young man she didn't know who rode up the mountain, looking profoundly uncomfortable with his assignment, and handed the sealed paper to Silas at the door. Silas read it. His expression shifted. He handed it to Dell without a word. It was an injunction, signed by a county magistrate whose name she didn't recognize. It prohibited Silas Creed from transmitting, distributing, or presenting any financial or survey documents related to Caldwell Timber Company operations pending a county-level review of the survey methodology used by one Everett Shaw. Dell read it twice. She read it a third time. Then she smiled. Silas was watching her. So was Everett, who had come in from the bunk room to see what the legal notice was. Both of them were watching her smile at an injunction, which was not a typical response to an injunction, and neither of them spoke because they were both, for their different reasons, waiting to understand what she'd seen. Locke obtained this quickly, she said. Too quickly for a legitimate magistrate process. He had this ready. He's been preparing it since Bly came back empty-handed yesterday, Everett said. Yes. Dell read the injunction a fourth time, not because she needed to, because she was savoring something. It prohibits Silas from transmitting or presenting the documents. She looked up. It's comprehensive on Silas. It covers everything he might do. She let the pause exist for a moment. My name is not on this document, she said. The kitchen was very quiet. Everett looked at the injunction. He read it. His eyebrows went up by a small but definitive amount. He didn't know your name, Everett said, or didn't think to include it. He was focused on Silas. He made the same mistake Orson Vale made, Dell said. He looked at a large woman who came to this ranch to fix leather goods, and he built his legal strategy around the man. She folded the injunction carefully. The injunction is valid. Silas cannot carry these documents or present them. He cannot go to the federal land office himself. She set the folded document on the table. I can. Silas looked at her with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between relief and a kind of dread, specific combination, of someone who has just been told the solution to a problem and has recognized simultaneously that the solution carries its own weight of risk. Everett, Dell said, is there anything in your survey certification that restricts how you may travel or who you may accompany? Everett thought for exactly 2 seconds. No. Then you're coming with me to the territorial capital. Yes, he said, without any hesitation. We leave at first light tomorrow. Yes, he said again. Dell turned back to Silas. He was standing very still. His hands were at his sides. He had the look of a man who has decided not to say the 10 things he could say and is working out which one, if any, to say instead. I'll have the horses ready, he said. His voice was even. She nodded. That evening, their last at Iron Pine before she left, Silas came to the porch again after supper. Dell came out and sat with him without being asked. The August night was cooler than it had been, a change in the mountain air that suggested the season was starting to think about turning. Weeks from now, but beginning to think. He handed her something. It was a folded piece of paper heavier than letter paper, the kind used for legal documents. She opened it. It was an employment contract. Iron Pine Ranch. Ranch manager. Her name written in his handwriting at the top. She looked at it for a long time. I didn't know what else to call it, he said. What you've been doing here. What you've built in 3 weeks out of accounts that were 6 months behind and a ranch that was being robbed. He looked at the valley. It's not what I want to call it, but it's what I can put on paper. Dell looked at the contract. She turned it over in her hands the way she turned everything over, looking for what was underneath the surface, what the numbers really said, what the words were standing in for. If I sign this, she said, then you have a reason to come back, he said. A legal reason. Your own stake in the ranch. She understood what he was saying, and she understood what he wasn't saying, which was the part that mattered more. She folded the contract and put it in her coat pocket. I'll sign it when I come back, she said. He looked at her. I promised I'd come back, she said. Let the contract be what I sign when I keep that promise. He was quiet for a while. Take the bay horse, he said. She's steadier on mountain roads than the roan. All right. And take the rifle from the tack room, the one hanging on the left side. I know how to handle a rifle. I know you do. He looked at the valley. Take it anyway. She would. She had already planned to. They sat on the porch until the night got cold, and then Dell went inside because she needed to sleep before a long ride. And she lay in the bed in the larger room, with a pine desk beside her, and listened to the mountain, and thought about Tabitha Crane and Fen Dobbins and the Mercer sons and the Astor widow and the Halloran family. And she thought about an injunction with one name missing from it, because a powerful man had looked at her and seen only what he expected. And she thought about Silas on the porch, holding a coffee cup in the dark, and saying the word home with more intention than the word usually carried. She slept. In the morning she would ride. She left Iron Pine in the dark. Not because she'd planned it that way exactly, but because she woke at 4 and couldn't go back to sleep, and lying in the dark thinking about the road ahead was worse than being on the road. So she dressed and packed the last of her things, and led the bay horse out of the barn, quietly, not wanting to wake Silas, not wanting the particular difficulty of a departure in daylight, with him standing at the gate watching her go. She should have known better. He was already at the gate. He was standing there in the pre-dawn dark with his coat on and a lantern in his hand, and he looked at her leading the bay through the barn door and didn't say anything about her leaving early. Didn't make any comment about being anticipated. Just held the lantern higher so she had light to work with while she finished tacking up. Everett came from the bunk room 10 minutes later, rubbing his face, slightly surprised to find both of them already in the yard. "We're leaving now," he said. "We're leaving now," Del said. She checked the bay's girth one more time. She checked the rifle in the saddle scabbard. She checked the saddlebag where the documentation packet was secured in the oilskin wrap she'd found in the tack room, waterproof, flat, tied with two separate lengths of cord. Silas held the bay's head while she mounted. When she was settled, he looked up at her. In the lantern light, his face was all angles and shadow, and she couldn't read his expression as well as she usually could, which was possibly why he'd chosen this particular dark morning to say the thing he said next. "Come home to me," he said, quietly. Just those 4 words without any scaffolding around them. Del sat on the bay horse in the 4 o'clock dark and held those words for a moment. "I told you I would," she said. "I know what you told me. I'm telling you what I want." He stepped back from the horse. "There's a difference." She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned the bay toward the mountain road and clicked her tongue, and they started moving. She did not look back. Looking back was the kind of thing that made leaving harder than it needed to be. And the road was long, and the stakes were too high for her to arrive at the territorial capital with anything less than her full attention available. The mountain road in the dark was not comfortable. The bay was steady. Silas had been right up that, picking her way down the grade with the careful attentiveness of a horse that had done this road many times and understood its particular hazards. Del kept the pace measured. There was no advantage in hurrying through the upper switchbacks in the dark, and arriving at the territorial capital 1 hour earlier was not worth a thrown shoe or a twisted ankle in a rut she couldn't see. Everett rode beside her when the road was wide enough, and behind her when it wasn't. He was not a talker in the early morning, which suited her perfectly. They descended through the pines in silence, with the sky beginning to gray at the eastern edge of the valley below them. And by the time they reached the valley floor, the lantern wasn't necessary anymore. And the world had that particular clean quality it has in the first hour of real light, before the heat builds and the day gets complicated. They stopped at Tabitha Crane's place just after 6. Del had planned this stop. Tabitha came to the door in her working clothes, which meant she'd been up for an hour at least. She took one look at Del on the bay horse, with the saddlebag and the rifle, and understood immediately. "You're going," she said. "Today," Del said. "I wanted you to know." Tabitha looked at the documentation saddlebag. Then she looked at Del's face. "Will it be enough?" Everett's certifications are solid and the account analysis is clear. If the federal land office does their job, yes. And if they don't, Del had thought about this. Then we find someone above the federal land office. Tabitha pressed her lips together. She went inside for a moment and came back with a sealed envelope. "That's a written account," she said. "My own words, describing what happened when I signed the Caldwell contracts. What I was told, what I understood, what I was actually paid." She held it out. "In case you need testimony from the landowners directly." Del took the envelope. She looked at it. "I didn't ask you for this," she said. "No," Tabitha said. "You didn't." The old woman's chin was up. There was something in her face that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago, when Del first sat at her kitchen table, not quite anger, but the close cousin of it, the particular expression of someone who has decided that the thing done to them was not acceptable and that they are done accepting it. "Go on, then. Don't waste morning." Del put the envelope in the saddlebag. "I'll send word as soon as I know something," she said. "I'll be here," Tabitha said. She said it the way a person says something they mean in multiple directions at once. Del and Everett rode south. The territorial capital was a day and a half's ride on a good road, slightly more on a road that had been poorly maintained through the summer, which this one had been. They made reasonable time through the morning, trading occasional observations about the road conditions and the state of the fencing they passed, which told a particular story about land management and investment that Del found herself cataloging automatically, even when she was trying not to. Around midday, they stopped to water the horses at a creek crossing and eat the food. Silas had packed cold biscuits and dried beef, the same meal he'd left on the wagon seat for her the first day she rode up the mountain, which she suspected was not accidental. She ate sitting on a log beside the creek while the horses drank. and she thought about Bramwell Locke. She had been thinking about him in pieces for weeks, as a name in ledger entries, as the force behind a payment scheme, as the man who'd sent Harlan Bly up the mountain with an offer, and then sent a magistrate's injunction when the offer failed. She had built a picture of him from documents and second-hand accounts, and Silas's careful descriptions, and the picture was of a man who operated at several removes from his own actions, who paid other people to do the things he wanted done, and kept himself behind layers of process and paper. Men like that, she had found in her experience, were often surprised when the process and paper stopped working. "You're quiet," Everett said. He was sitting on the creek bank, eating his own biscuit. "I'm thinking. About the federal office? About what happens if the federal investigator is like the magistrate who signed the injunction." Everett considered this. "Ward's reputation is clean. I've worked with federal surveyors who've dealt with his office before. He's difficult, and he's slow, and he doesn't like being rushed. But he's honest. As far as anyone knows. That's enough," Dell said. "Honest and difficult I can work with. Honest and slow I can work with." She finished her biscuit and stood up. "It's dishonest and fast, that's the problem." They rode through the afternoon and made camp at dusk in a shallow draw off the main road, the kind of spot that offered tree cover and a reasonable sight line on the road without advertising their presence. Dell had suggested it, Everett had agreed without asking why, which she appreciated, because explaining that she was wary of Locke's men on the road felt overly dramatic stated plainly, even if it was entirely reasonable. She sat watch for the first 2 hours of the night while Everett slept, which she'd also suggested, because she wasn't going to sleep anyway, and she'd rather be useful than lie in the dark thinking. The night was quiet insect sounds, the distant sound of water somewhere, the horses moving occasionally. Nothing on the road, no lanterns, nothing. She woke Everett at midnight and slept for 5 hours and was up before him again. They reached the territorial capital the next afternoon. The federal land office was on the second floor of a building on the main administrative street, a solid, unremarkable structure that housed several territorial government functions and smelled of old paper and institutional permanence. Dell and Everett tied the horses and went up the stairs and were told by a clerk at the front desk that investigator Lucian Ward was in a meeting and could possibly see them at the end of the day. Dell looked at the clerk. "Tell him," she said, "that we have documentation of a systematic land fraud operation spanning at least 4 years and 6 properties in Coldwater Gap Valley, including volume theft in addition to rate manipulation, and that one of the property owners is operating under a county injunction obtained through a compromised magistrate that is designed to prevent this evidence from reaching a federal office." She said it evenly, without raising her voice. "Tell him that specifically, please." The clerk blinked. He went down a hallway and was gone for 4 minutes. He came back and said Investigator Ward would see them now. Lucian Ward was a tall, sparse man in his late 50s, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the look of someone who had been dealing with complicated land cases for long enough that nothing should surprise him anymore, but who maintained a specific alertness anyway, because experience had taught him that complacency was how fraud succeeded. He gestured them to chairs across his desk and looked at the documentation package Dell laid in front of him. "Walk me through it," he said. She did. She took 40 minutes. She took him through the rate analysis first, then the volume discrepancy evidence, then Everett's survey certifications, then the individual property records, then the pattern analysis that showed the fraud was systematic and consistent rather than the result of accounting errors. She answered his questions as they came. He asked good questions, the kind that went to the structural weaknesses in the argument rather than the surface details. And she had anticipated most of them and had the answers ready. And the others she answered from the analysis she'd been running in her head for 3 weeks. When she finished, Ward sat back in his chair. He looked at the documentation for a long moment. "Bramwell Locke," he said. "Yes. His operation in this valley has been on a watch list for 2 years, Ward said. General concerns about contract practices. Nothing specific enough to act on. He picked up volume discrepancy analysis and looked at it. This is specific." "Yes," Dell said. "The injunction against Creed is why I'm here instead of him." Ward looked at her over his reading glasses. "The injunction doesn't cover you." "No." He looked at the documentation again. "Who prepared this?" "I did." "What's your professional background?" "Seamstress," Dell said. Ward looked at her. Self-taught in accounting, she added. I've been managing books for small businesses and landowners for several years. Informally, he held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked back at the documentation with what she recognized, from years of watching people read things, as genuine engagement, the particular quality of attention that means the material is doing what you built it to do. I'm going to need a week to review this fully, he said. And I'll need Shaw's survey certifications, independently verified by a federal surveyor, before I can open a formal investigation. How long does that take? 2 weeks if I push it. 3 if I don't. Push it, Dell said. Ward looked at her again. Corner of his mouth moved in a way that wasn't quite a smile. I'll see what I can do. He picked up Tabitha's envelope, which Dell had placed in the package without comment and which he'd noticed. What's this? Witness testimony from one of the defrauded landowners. Written account of her contracting experience with Caldwell Timber. He opened it and read it. He read it more slowly than he'd read the analytical documents, not because it was more complex, but because it was different in kind. Tabitha's handwriting was plain and unadorned, and her account was plain and unadorned in the same way, describing what she'd been told and what she'd understood and what she'd been paid, with the particular precision of someone who had thought about these things for a long time and wanted to get them right. Ward set the letter down. There are 5 other landowners, Dell said. I can have written accounts from all of them within 2 weeks. Get them, he said. The analytical documentation builds the legal case. The witness accounts make it real. He looked at her steadily. A judge sees numbers. He sees a financial dispute. He sees a 71-year-old man who sold livestock to pay bills he shouldn't have owed. He sees theft. I know, Dell said. Ward stood up, which was the indication the meeting was over. He extended his hand across the desk, and Dell shook it. Miss Harrow, he said, I'm opening a preliminary inquiry effective today. That means Locke's Caldwell contracts are under federal scrutiny, which will slow him down regardless of what happens with the full investigation. He held her hand for a moment. You did good work here. There are 6 families in that valley who need more than good work, Dell said. They need results. Then come back in 3 weeks, he said. I'll have them. She and Everett left the office with a federal receipt, a formal document acknowledging the evidence submission and the opening of the preliminary inquiry, stamped with a territorial seal. Dell held it carefully. She put it in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her body. Outside on the street, Everett exhaled slowly. That went better than I expected, he said. It went the way it should have, Dell said. She was already thinking about the road back. We'll stay the night here. I want to get back on the road early tomorrow. Agreed. He paused. Dell, what you did in there was what the situation needed, she said. I was going to say it was impressive. I know what you were going to say. She managed a small smile. Thank you, Everett, for the certifications, for all of it. This doesn't work without you. It doesn't work without your analysis, he said. I just measured things. You made sense of them. They found a boarding house on a side street, plain and clean and entirely adequate. Dell ate supper in the small dining room, alone, Everett having retired early. She was tired in the specific way that comes after sustained high-stakes effort, not the tiredness of physical work, but the tiredness of having held herself at a particular pitch of attention for too long. She thought about Silas at Iron Pine. She thought about what he was doing right now, probably in the barn, or checking the lower pasture fence, or sitting on the porch in the mountain dark. She thought about his face in the lantern light at 4 a.m, and the 4 words he'd said. She took the employment contract out of her coat pocket and looked at it. She hadn't signed it before she left. She'd told him she'd sign it when she came back, and she'd meant it as a promise of return, a structural reason to do the thing she intended to do anyway. But sitting here in the boarding house dining room with the federal receipt in her inside pocket and 2 days of road between her and Iron Pine, she understood that the contract wasn't actually the point. Put it back in her pocket. In the morning, they started back. The road north was the same road, reversed the same creek crossing, the same badly maintained stretches, the same gradual change in landscape as the valley opened, and then the mountains asserted themselves and the air changed. Rose rode steadily and kept her eyes on the road and let herself, for the first time in weeks, be somewhere that wasn't in the middle of a problem she was trying to solve. It lasted about 3 hours. They were on the upper section of the valley road, where it narrowed between 2 long ridge lines before the turnoff toward Coldwater Gap and the mountain track to Iron Pine, when Dell saw the horses. 2 of them, standing across the road. Riderless or apparently riderless, which was different because the riders were on foot and positioned in the tree line on either side of the road. Dell pulled the bay to a stop. Everett came up beside her and saw what she'd seen and went very still. "Keep your hands where they can see them," Dell said quietly. "Don't go for anything." 2 men came out of the trees. She recognized one of them, the larger of the 2 men who'd come up the mountain with Harlan Bly. He was wearing a different coat, but she'd cataloged him precisely enough that the coat didn't matter. The other one she didn't know. The large man looked at Dell on the bay horse, and the look that crossed his face was a particular kind, a man recalculating. Finding the math he'd been given didn't match the math he was looking at. He'd been told, she suspected, that a large woman and a surveyor would be easy to stop. "Miss Harrow," he said. The pleasant tone was gone. He hadn't learned it from Bly. It had never been available to him. "We're going to need those documents." "They've already been filed," Dell said. He blinked. "What?" "The documentation has been submitted to the Federal Land Office. A preliminary inquiry is open. The receipt is in coat." She kept her voice level. "Taking the papers I'm currently carrying won't change that." The 2 men looked at each other. "We were told you just left the capital yesterday," the large man said. "That's correct. The office takes weeks to." "Investigator Ward opened a preliminary inquiry effective the day we arrived," Dell said. 2 days ago. She kept her hands visible, and her back straight, and her voice entirely steady, which was requiring a significant effort she did not intend to make visible. "Harassing me on this road accomplishes nothing for your employer, except adding obstruction to the list of charges a federal investigator is now building." Another exchange of looks. "You're bluffing," the second man said. "I have the receipt in my coat," Dell said. "Would you like to read it?" Neither of them moved. She reached very carefully into her inside coat pocket and produced the federal receipt and held it up where they could see the territorial seal on it. The large man stared at it. He was not, she assessed, a man who understood complex legal documents at a glance. But the territorial seal was large and the stamp date was clear, and whatever he'd expected to find on that road, it was not this. Something happened then that Dell had not planned for and could not have planned for, because it depended on Tabitha Crane having done something she hadn't told Dell she was going to do. From the tree line on the west side of the road behind the 2 men, not behind Dell and Everett, came the sound of horses. Several horses, moving without particular attempt at quiet. 3 county deputies came out of the trees. They were not Locke's men. Dell could tell by the way the 2 roadblockers turned at the sound, and their faces changed the specific expression of men who have just realized the geometry of the situation is different from what they were told. The lead deputy, a solid man in his 40s, with a weathered face and a badge that caught the afternoon light, pulled up and looked at the scene on the road with the calm assessment of someone who had been expecting approximately this. "Miss Harrow," he said. "Deputy Cal Weston. I apologize for the timing. We came up faster than I expected." Dell looked at him. "Mrs. Crane sent you. She came to our office 3 days ago with a duplicate report and a description of what she anticipated might happen on the return road." He looked at the 2 men, who had not moved but whose options had narrowed considerably in the last 30 seconds. "Said a woman was going to the Capitol to file federal evidence, and she wanted someone honest on the road when she came back." Dell sat on the bay horse for a moment. Tabitha Crane, who had spent 3 years apologizing for her own poverty. Tabitha Crane, who had folded her hands on her kitchen table and absorbed the news of what had been done to her with a specific quietness that Dell had read as fragility. Tabitha Crane, who had apparently spent those same 3 days riding to find deputies she trusted and laying a trap for the men she knew would come. "Thank you," Dell said. She said it to the empty air as much as to Deputy Weston. Then to Weston. "The man on the left was at Iron Pine Ranch 4 days ago in the company of Harlan Bly. He's employed by Bramwell Locke." "We know," Weston said. He looked at the man with the flatness of someone who has been waiting for this specific opportunity. Both of them. The 2 men were taken without incident, which was the least dramatic possible conclusion to a confrontation that had been making Dell's hands shake since she first saw the horses across the road. She waited until they were secured and moving before she let herself feel the shaking, and then she pressed her hands in flat against the saddle horn and breathed and let it pass. Everett pulled his horse up alongside her. "Are you all right?" "Fine," she said. Her voice was steady. The shaking was only in her hands. "Fine." Weston came back from supervising his deputies and looked at her with particular respect of someone who has been given a clear account of a situation and has now seen it play out as described. The federal inquiry, he started, is open, Dell said. Ward will be in contact with your office within 3 weeks. When he is, the witness testimonies from the landowners in the valley will strengthen the case. She looked at Weston steadily. I'd like you to be available for that conversation. I'll make sure I am, he said. She nodded. She picked up the reins. Miss Harrow, Weston said. She looked back. Tabitha Crane said to tell you, and I'm quoting here because she was specific about the wording. He paused. She said to tell you, the books were right. The management wasn't the problem. Dell looked at him for a moment. She turned the bay north. The last section of road, before the mountain turnoff, was empty and easy, and she and Everett rode it in the late afternoon light without conversation, the horses moving steadily and the valley opening around them, and the mountains growing larger ahead. Dell's hands had stopped shaking entirely by the time they reached the turnoff, and somewhere on the long grade up the mountain road, her mind settled into a particular stillness, not the forced stillness of someone managing crisis, but the real kind, the kind that comes when the hard thing has been done, and the road ahead is simply the road home. Iron Pine came into view in the early evening. The way the house sat against the mountain in the last of the light was the same as it had been the first time she saw it from the wagon seat, except that it didn't look unfamiliar anymore. She noticed the vegetable garden had been watered recently, and the water trough was sitting level on its repaired foundation, and the barn door was standing open, in the manner it always stood open when Silas was working inside. Then she saw him. He was standing at the gate. She understood, looking at him, standing there in the evening light, that he had been watching the road, that he had come out to the gate, because the road was the only direction news could arrive from. And standing at the gate was the closest he could get to the road without getting on a horse and riding down it, which she suspected had cost him something not to do. She dismounted before she reached the gate. Her legs were tired from 2 days of riding, and she needed a moment to find her balance, which she found without ceremony. She walked the bay the last 100 yards. Silas opened the gate. He looked at her the way he looked at things that mattered, with the particular focused attention that took in everything available and processed it quietly. He looked at her face, and then at the saddlebag, and then at Everett coming through the gate behind her. She reached into her inside coat pocket. She pulled out the federal receipt and held it up where he could see the territorial seal. Ward opened a preliminary inquiry 2 days ago, she said. Locke's contracts are under federal scrutiny. We have 3 weeks until the full investigation scope is determined. She paused. His men stopped us on the road north. Tabitha Crane had deputies waiting. Silas looked at the receipt. He looked at her face. Are you hurt? He said. No, Everett? No, Everett said from behind her. Silas let out a slow breath. It was the closest thing to visible relief she'd seen from him. Dell lowered the receipt. She was tired, the genuine kind, the kind you don't fully register until the thing you've been doing is finished. Her hands, which had been entirely steady since the road, felt suddenly heavy. I told you I'd come back, she said. You did, he said. I told you I'd file the documents. You did that too. She looked at him. He was looking at her in the way he'd been looking at her more frequently in recent weeks, with the expression she'd been cataloging and not naming. The one that was something past Assessor's attention, and something before whatever it might eventually become. She reached into her coat pocket. She produced the employment contract he'd given her the night before she left. She held it out. Do you have a pen? She said. Something moved in his face. He produced a pen from his shirt pocket with the promptness of a man who had been carrying it ready. Dell smoothed the contract against the top of the fence post. She signed her name at the bottom, in the neat compressed handwriting she used for documents that mattered. She handed it back to him. He took it. He looked at her name on it for a moment. Then he looked up, and Dell saw in his face, clearly and without ambiguity, what the expression had been all along. Come inside, he said. You need to eat something. I know, she said. She was already walking toward the house, the receipt in one hand and the saddlebag over her shoulder, and the bay's reins in the other, moving with the specific tiredness of someone who has done the hard thing and come out the other side, heading toward a kitchen where there would be food and lamplight and the particular warmth of a place that had, somewhere between the water trough and the account books and the 4 o'clock morning at the gate, become the place she was thinking of when she thought about going home. Silas fell into step beside her. He didn't take the saddlebag or offer to take the reins or do any of the things a man does when he's decided a woman needs managing. He just walked beside her, at her pace, toward the lit house. That, she thought, was exactly right. The 3 weeks Ward had asked for became 4. Dell knew this was coming before the 4th week started. She knew it the way she knew most things from the accumulation of small indicators that a person pays attention to when they've learned that the gap between what institutions promise and what they deliver is rarely 0. She didn't say this to Silas or to Tabitha or to the other families who were waiting. She said the investigation was proceeding and that federal timelines were variable and that no news from Ward's office was not the same as bad news. She believed the last part. The first 2 were just true. What she did with the waiting was work. She had Fen Dobbins's written testimony to collect, and the Mercer families, and the Hollorans. And she rode the South Road twice in the first week, doing what she'd promised, Ward gathering the plain, unadorned accounts of people who had been told complicated things and signed papers they trusted and spent. Years paying for that trust with their own poverty. She sat at kitchen tables and listened and wrote down what she was told in her own handwriting, and then had each person read it back to correct anything she'd gotten wrong. Fen Dobbins, 71 years old, with the careful speech of someone who had taught himself to read as an adult and had never quite lost the pride of it, read his account back twice and then said, "That's right. That's exactly right," in the tone of someone who had expected to be misrepresented and had been prepared to correct it and found, unexpectedly, that there was nothing to correct. "Thank you," he said, "not for writing it, for getting it right." Dell folded the account into its envelope and put it in her coat. The Mercer boys brothers, late 20s, the kind of young men who carried their father's opinions, and their own resentment of those opinions in equal measure were more resistant. The older one wanted to know why they should trust a process that had done nothing for 6 years while they watched their timber income shrink. The younger one mostly watched Dell and said nothing. "You don't have to trust the process," Dell said to the older one. "You have to decide whether doing nothing for another 6 years gets you closer to what you're owed." The older one opened his mouth. The younger one said, "Write it down, Caleb." Caleb wrote it down. The Hallorans took the least time. They had 4 children and 2 aging parents on the property, and the mathematics of their situation left very little room for argument. They understood precisely what $300 in back payments would mean to them, and they understood it without needing it explained. By the end of the 2nd week, Dell had 6 complete witness accounts, organized and sealed, ready to be sent to Ward's office by post, with a cover letter she wrote herself and checked 3 times. She mailed them on a Tuesday. On Thursday, Harlan Bly was arrested. Not for coming to Iron Pine, not for sending threatening notes, or for the 2 men on the road, although Deputy Weston had been building that case separately and patiently. He was arrested because Lucian Ward's office had begun examining Caldwell Timber's internal correspondence, and one of the letters that came to light was from Bly to a Caldwell accountant, instructing him to maintain the rate differential on Iron Pine, specifically because Creed is the type to investigate if given time, and the gap needs to stay within what looks like market variance. That letter, Everett told Dell when he brought the news up from town, was the thing that moved the case from civil fraud to criminal conspiracy. Deliberate concealment, Everett said. He was at the kitchen table at Iron Pine, and his satisfaction was the careful, precise kind that suited him. They can demonstrate that Locke knew and directed the underpayment scheme specifically to stay within ranges that wouldn't trigger investigation. That's not an accounting error. That's intent. Bly will negotiate, Dell said. He'll give Ward what he needs on Locke to reduce his own exposure. Ward is counting on that. Good, she looked at the table. How long until Locke himself is charged? Ward said 2 weeks. Maybe 3. Dell looked at the window. It was early October now, and the mountain outside was beginning to show its autumn, not the full color yet, but the first suggestions of it in the highest elevations, where the aspens were going to gold against the green pine. 2 weeks, she said, then it's done. It was actually 18 days. Bramwell Locke was formally charged on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of October, with 5 counts of federal land fraud and 2 counts of criminal conspiracy, the charges building on Bly's testimony and Ward's analysis and the 6 volumes of property account evidence and Everett's survey certifications and the witness accounts of 6 ordinary people who had signed papers. They trusted and been robbed systematically for years. Dell heard about it from Weston, who rode up to Iron Pine himself to deliver the news, which she appreciated, because it meant she didn't have to wait for it to travel through the usual channels of rumor and distortions that served as Coldwater Gap's communication system. She was in the yard when he arrived, repairing a section of fence that had shifted in the week's wind. She set down her tools and listened to him, and when he finished, she said, "What happens to the contracts?" "Suspended pending restitution determination," Weston said. "The landowners will have the right to renegotiate with any timber buyer they choose, or to hold their timber until the market rate improves. Locke's operation doesn't have claim to anything in this valley while the criminal case is proceeding." "How long will the criminal case take?" "Years," Weston said. "These things always do. But the restitution calculation is separate, Ward says, that can be finalized within 6 months. Dell picked up her tools. She thought about 6 months for Fen Dobbins, 71, who had been selling stock for 2 years to pay bills he shouldn't have owed. 6 months was a long time. Can the restitution timeline be separated from the criminal proceedings? That's a legal question I can't answer. Then I'll put it in a letter to Ward. Weston looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd seen from him before, the specific look of a man who keeps encountering a person operating at a higher level of thoroughness than he anticipated, and has decided to simply stop being surprised by it. "I'll let you do that," he said. She wrote the letter that evening. She made the argument clearly and without excess that the defrauded landowners, most of them elderly or economically marginal, should not be required to wait for the resolution of a years-long criminal prosecution to receive the income they were demonstrably owed. She cited the established values from the account analysis, attached the relevant section of Everett certification, and asked Ward to confirm whether an expedited restitution process could be initiated independently. Ward's response arrived in 10 days. The answer was yes. The restitution process was formally separated from the criminal prosecution in the first week of November, and the initial payment determinations, interim amounts, partial, pending the full calculation, went out to the 6 properties by the end of the month. Tabitha Crane received her first check on a cold morning in late November. Dell was there when it arrived. Not by plan, she had come to bring the final copy of the account summary Tabitha had asked for, and the postwriter happened to arrive the same hour. She stood in Tabitha's kitchen while the old woman opened the envelope and read the amount and sat down in her kitchen chairs with the specific heaviness of someone whose legs have just registered something their mind hasn't caught up to yet. Tabitha looked at the check for a long time. Then she put it face down on the table and pressed both hands flat on top of it, and her face did something complicated, not crying. Not quite. But the particular expression of someone holding something too large for their face to contain, without showing the strain. "I sold my father's surveying equipment," she said. 2 years ago. I thought I had no choice." Dell sat down across from her. "You'll be able to replace it," Dell said. It wasn't about the value. Tabitha kept her hands on the check. "He used it for 40 years. It was the only thing I had left of him." She looked up. "I thought I'd made the wrong decision my whole life about this land. That I should have sold it. That I wasn't capable of running it." Her jaw was set. "I was capable. I was just being robbed." "Yes," Dell said. "You were." Tabitha looked at her for a long moment. "You walked into my house 6 weeks ago," the old woman said, "and you told me the truth about what had been done to me. You didn't soften it. You didn't treat me like I was too old to hear it." She folded her hands on top of the check. "I want you to know that mattered. The way you said it, like it was something that had happened to me, not something I'd done to myself." She paused. "I've been carrying the wrong story for 3 years. You gave me the right one." Dell looked at the table. She thought about stories. About the ones people tell themselves in the dark, in the gap between what happens and what they can understand about why it happened. About how easy it was, when you were the one the story was happening to write yourself as the problem rather than as the person a problem had been done to. She had told herself the wrong story, too, for a long time. She had told herself a story about a woman who was too large and too plain and too particular to be wanted, and she had built a life that fit that story, small and contained, with no room in it for anything that could be taken away. Iron Pine had not fit that story. Silas had not fit that story. And somewhere in the account books and the kitchen tables and the mountain road and the porch, at 4 a.m, the story had changed. "I'm glad I could help," Dell said. It came out quietly, without the professional distance she sometimes used when she didn't want to feel something too directly. Tabitha reached across the table and put her hand over Dell's for a moment. They sat like that for a minute, two women in a kitchen in November, with the first check of a long overdue reckoning on the table between them. Then Dell cleared her throat and said, "You should deposit that today before the post office closes." And Tabitha laughed a real laugh, the kind that has some relief in it, and said she intended to. Dell rode back up the mountain. The change in Coldwater Gap happened slowly, which was how real changes happened, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small reversals that eventually added up to something different. People who had not spoken to Dell directly, or who had spoken to her only in the transactional way of people conducting business with someone they don't particularly regard, began addressing her differently. Not with excessive warmth, there wasn't a conversion moment, no scene of public apology or general contrition, but with the specific shift in register that occurs when a community has been forced to update its assessment of someone and is navigating what that means for ordinary interactions. She went to Coldwater Gap for supplies in the second week of November, the first time she'd been to town since the investigation became public knowledge. She had a list. She went to 3 shops and conducted her business, and was leaving when she passed the general store. She stopped. She stood on the sidewalk in front of Orson Vale's store for a moment, looking at the window display. Then she went inside. Orson Vale was behind the counter, in the same position she had last seen him, ledger open, pen in hand, the proprietorial attitude of a man in his own domain. He looked up when she came in, and his expression did several things in rapid succession, none of them comfortable. "Miss Harrow," he said. His voice was careful. "Vale." She set her list on the counter. Flour, salt pork, thread, the same 3 items as the first time, and the salt for preserving, 5 pounds. He gathered the items without comment. His usual commentary, the kind he'd offered the last time she was in his store, with an audience and a performance to give, was entirely absent. When he had everything on the counter, he named a total that was his standard price, nothing adjusted. Dell counted out the money. She was not short. She hadn't been short since the first month at Iron Pine. She put the coins on the counter. Then she reached into her coat pocket and put 3 additional coins beside them. Orson Vale looked at the extra coins. "I've been told," he said slowly, "that you'd like store credit." Given the circumstances, he stopped. He was not quite able to complete the sentence, which contained too many things he would have had to own directly. "Keep the credit," Dell said. She picked up her parcels. "Keep the coins, too. Call them a fee for the lesson." He looked at her. "The lesson," she said, "being that hunger doesn't announce itself by how a person looks." She said it without anger. The anger had burned off a long time ago, somewhere on the mountain road in the dark, somewhere in 6 kitchens with account books and folded hands. What was left wasn't warm exactly, but it was clean. "Good day, Mr. Vale." She walked out. She did not look back. Some things, she had learned, you simply leave behind you. Not because they didn't happen, but because carrying them costs more than they're worth, and the weight of old humiliations belongs to the people who caused them, not to the person they were aimed at. The autumn moved toward winter, and Iron Pine moved with it. There was real work in the seasonal transition cattle, brought to lower pastures, supplies inventoried and supplemented, the endless maintenance that a mountain ranch required before the first hard freeze came. Dell worked alongside Silas through most of it, and they developed the particular rhythm of 2 people who have learned each other's patterns well enough to work in the same space without coordination becoming friction. She noticed during this time that she had stopped calculating how long she was staying. She had stopped treating Iron Pine as a place she was visiting and started treating it as a place she lived, which was a different relationship, entirely one that involved opinions about where the axe should be kept and which shelf in the pantry made more sense for the preserving jars, and the somewhat heated exchange about the fence line on the north. Pasture that had been laid 6 degrees off true and needed to be corrected before spring. Silas lost that argument, which he took with reasonable grace. One evening in late November, the kind of evening where the first real cold of the season had settled over the mountain, and the fireplace had moved from optional to necessary, Silas came inside from the barn and found Dell at the kitchen table not working. This was unusual enough that he stopped and looked at her. She was just sitting. Her hands were in her lap. She was looking at the fire. "What's wrong?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Then I found the photograph. The first day, in the desk drawer. I wasn't looking for it." He took his coat off and hung it. He came and sat across from her at the table. I know, he said. She looked at him. You knew I found it? You were different that afternoon. Quieter. He looked at the fire. Clara and Maisie. I figured. I should have told you. You were respecting something that wasn't yours to comment on, he said. That's different from hiding it. She looked at her hands in her lap. I didn't know whether to ask about them, whether you wanted to talk about them. Sometimes I do and sometimes I don't, he said simply. Tonight I don't mind. He paused. Maisie's had a way of finding every mud puddle on the property. I don't know how she did it. Clara claimed it was a gift. His mouth curved slightly at the corner. Probably wasn't wrong. Dell smiled. Clara would have liked you, Silas said. He said it without any particular weight on it, not as a comparison or a compliment designed to accomplish something, just as an observation he'd been sitting with for a while and decided to say. She had no patience for people who dressed things up. She said what she meant and expected the same back. He looked at the fire. She would have told you your fence line argument was right and mine was wrong. It was, Dell said. I know, he said. I knew at the time. She looked at him. Why did you argue it then? 'Cause, he said, with the particular deliberateness of a man choosing honesty over dignity, I had been managing this ranch alone for a long time, and it was strange, having someone tell me what needed changing. I wasn't arguing the fence line. I was arguing the principle. Dell considered this. The principle being that you'd been right about everything long enough that being wrong felt like loss. Something like that, I understand that, she said. More than you might think. He looked at her across the table in the firelight. Dell, he said. Silas, I want to ask you something. I know, she said. She'd known for about 3 weeks, the way she knew most things from small indicators that accumulated into a clear picture, the way he'd been choosing to be wherever she was, the way he'd stopped being careful about the expression she'd cataloged and not named, the employment contract and what it had actually been standing in for. You know what I'm going to ask, he said. I have a reasonable hypothesis, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, without ceremony or scaffolding, stay. Not as ranch manager, not on a contract, just stay. To me, the fire shifted and resettled. Dell looked at the man across the table, the mountain cowboy, who had seen her holding a hitching rail and brought food for the road, and offered work when she needed it, and never once in all the weeks since made. Her feel that his house was his, and she was visiting. Who had told her about Clara and Maisie on a porch at night, and let her see the weight of that, without trying to make the weight smaller. Who had lost the fence line argument with reasonable grace. She thought about what she'd told him on that same porch. About the stepmother and the 17-year-old and the life built small and contained, with no room for anything that could be taken away. She thought about what it meant that she had stopped calculating how long she was staying. I'm already staying, she said. He looked at her. I stopped thinking about leaving, she said. Somewhere around the water trough. She looked at the fire. That was probably the fence line argument that did it. The fence line argument made you decide to stay? Watching you lose it gracefully, she said, yes. Quiet for a moment. Then he said, will you marry me? Not with the rising inflection of a question, with the flat directness he used for everything that mattered, which was its own kind of honesty. Dell looked at her hands in her lap. She thought about all the years of telling herself the story of a woman too large and too plain and too particular to be wanted by anyone who saw her clearly. She thought about Silas, who had been seeing her clearly since the hitching rail, and who had apparently arrived at a different conclusion. Yes, she said, not with the cadence of someone surprised, with the cadence of someone who has arrived at a right answer and recognized it. They married in late autumn. A small ceremony with Everett Shaw and Tabitha Crane and Deputy Weston and the Mercer brothers and Fen Dobbins and the Hallorans, all of them standing in the cold mountain air outside Iron Pine, because the house wasn't large enough to hold everyone, and nobody wanted to do it without everyone. Tabitha cried. Fen Dobbins brought a bottle of something he'd been keeping for a significant occasion, and said he'd been waiting for a significant occasion for 11 years and this qualified. The older Mercer brother, Caleb, who had been the resistant one at the kitchen table, shook Silas's hand for a long time and then said to Dell, thank you. Counts. For all of it. He said it the way someone says something they've been working up to with the particular effort of a man not accustomed to saying, thank you for things that matter. Thank your brother, Dell said. He's the one who told you to stop arguing. Caleb looked slightly caught out. The younger Mercer brother grinned. Winter settled over Iron Pine with the particular completeness of mountain winters, full and heavy in total, in a way that lowland winters never managed. Dell worked through it. The ranch accounts, now clean and current, and organized into a system that would stay organized because she'd built it to run on its own logic rather than on her constant intervention. The sewing work that still came, because word had traveled that the best seamstress in the county was now located up the mountain, and people made the trip for work they couldn't get done elsewhere. Correspondence with Ward's office, which continued as the criminal case against Locke moved through its slow federal process charges confirmed, preliminary hearings, the grinding legal machinery that would eventually deliver an outcome in its own time and could not be hurried by anyone. She wrote Ward regular letters. He wrote back with the professional courtesy of a man who had learned that letters from Delphine Harrow contained questions that deserved answers. On a morning in February, with snow deep on the mountain and the world reduced to the known perimeter of the ranch and the narrow road down, Dell went looking for a sewing needle. She was working on a commission, a set of saddlebags for Everett, who had officially hung out a shingle as an independent surveyor in Coldwater Gap and was doing more business than he'd predicted and told him, and she needed a particular weight of needle that she was certain she'd packed in the larger of her 2 sewing cases. It wasn't there. She checked both cases. She checked the workroom she'd set up in the smaller bedroom. She checked her coat pockets and the desk drawers, the shelf in the tack room, where she sometimes left materials when she was working on ranch equipment. No needle. Silas found her in the workroom, checking the sewing case again. "What are you looking for?" "The heavy needle, the one for saddle work." He leaned in the doorway. "Which case?" "It should be in the large one." "I can't find it." He looked at Dell, he said. Something in his voice made her stop searching and look at him. "I need to tell you something," he said. He was leaning in the doorway with the expression she'd seen on the porch when he told her about Clara and Maisie, not heavy exactly, but carrying something. "What?" she said. "The first night you stayed at Iron Pine," he said. "You had both sewing cases on the floor by your room. I saw the needle on the floor beside the large case. In the morning, I think it had fallen out. I picked it up." He paused. "I was going to give it back to you, and I kept finding reasons not to. And then you said you were leaving to walk back down to town, and I stopped." Dell looked at him. "You kept it," she said. "I put it in the tack room," he said. "On the shelf." He said it with the particular expression of a man who has been carrying a small private foolishness and has decided after several months that it is now safe to admit to. "I told myself you'd need to come back for it." Dell stared at him. "You manipulated a needle," she said, "to get me to come back. I preferred to think of it as creating an incentive." She stopped. She started again. "Silas, I left that needle on purpose." Now he stared at her. "I knew I'd forgotten it," she said. "I left it anyway, because I wanted to come back and I was afraid to say so." She looked at him steadily. "I manufactured a reason." The kitchen was entirely quiet. Then Silas Creed, a man who laughed rarely and smiled sparingly, and kept most of what he felt in the particular stillness of his face, laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere unexpected, from the sudden view of something that is genuinely, absurdly funny in the specific way that things are funny when they are also true and tender and a little embarrassing. Dell stood in the workroom and listened to it, and felt something open in her chest, not dramatically, not like a revelation, but the way a window feels when you've been in a closed room for a long time. Started laughing too. They stood in the workroom in February, with snow on the mountain outside, and laughed at themselves and at each other, and at the particular human comedy of 2 people who had both been afraid and had both, independently and without knowing it, left themselves a thread to follow back. Later, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the comfortable warmth of the fire and the snow making the world outside the window into something simple and white, Dell thought about what it meant, not the needle specifically, but the whole shape of it. She had spent years in a life that didn't take up much space. She had kept herself small and careful and contained because expansion meant exposure, and exposure meant the possibility of the things she'd been told since she was 17 was inevitable rejection. The confirmation of the story she'd been carrying about what she was and what she deserved. What she had learned, sitting at Silas's kitchen table in the second winter of a life that had stopped being small, was that the story had always been wrong. Not because she was exceptional or because her story was special, but because the people who tell you who you are based on how you look are not authorities on who you are. They are just people with opinions and enough power in that moment to make their opinions feel like facts. The facts were these: she was a skilled woman who had worked hard and thought clearly and refused to stay fallen when people knocked her down. She had walked into 6 strangers' kitchens and told the truth about what had been done to them, and let that truth be enough. She had ridden a 2-day road alone with federal evidence against a powerful man and come back with a receipt, and her hands only shaking afterward. She had built something. Out of account books and saddlebags and a water trough foundation, and the specific stubbornness of someone who had been told too many times what she couldn't do. Bramwell Locke's trial, when it finally came, took 3 weeks and produced a conviction on 4 of the 5 counts. He received a federal sentence of 7 years and a restitution order that stripped his valley holdings to pay the defrauded landowners what they were owed. Dell heard the verdict from Ward's letter, which arrived on a March morning when the snow was beginning to soften and the first suggestion of spring was in the runoff coming down the mountain. She read the letter at the kitchen table and then set it down. Silas was watching her from across the table. "Done," she said. "Done," he agreed. She looked at the letter for another moment. Then she looked out the window at the mountain, where the aspens were still bare but would not be for long, and at the vegetable garden she'd already started planning for larger this year, better organized, with a proper preservation schedule so nothing went soft on the vine the way the squash had that first August. She thought about Tabitha Crane, who had her father's surveying equipment back, bought at an estate sale in the valley, found by the younger Mercer brother, who had been quietly looking since November. She thought about Fen Dobbins, who had bought back 2 of the head of cattle he'd sold, and said 2 was enough for now, that he was getting old and 2 was a reasonable number of cattle for a man of 71. She thought about the Mercer boys expanding their south pasture, and the Astor widow hiring a hand for the first time in 4 years, and Everett Shaw's new surveying office with its hand-lettered sign, visible from the main street of Coldwater Gap. She thought about the morning in that same town, when she had stood at a hitching rail in the August heat, with 3 coins in her fist and nothing left to manage herself with. She hadn't known, that morning, that the worst moment of her recent life was also the last moment of her old one. She hadn't known that the wagon stopping on the street was the thing that would change everything, or that the change would look like account books and mountain roads and a needle left deliberately on a workroom floor. That was the nature of it, she thought. The turns you don't see coming are usually the ones that matter. The help you almost refuse, because you've learned that needing help is something to be ashamed of. Place you almost don't stay because staying feels like hope, and hope has cost you before. Silas reached across the table and put his hand over hers, not saying anything. Just there, she turned her hand over and held his. Outside, the mountain was moving toward spring the way it always did, slowly, without drama, the snow pulling back from the south-facing slopes first, the aspens beginning to bud, the creek running louder with the melt. Iron pine sat against the mountain the way it always had, low and solid and weathered to silver gray, built by someone thinking about permanence. Delphine Harrow Creed, who had once entered Coldwater Gap, hungry and penniless and ashamed of the space she occupied, sat at her own kitchen table in the morning light, loved without conditions, financially steady, respected in the valley for work she had done, with her own hands and her own mind, and entirely comfortable for the first time in her life, entirely comfortable taking up every inch of the life she had fought to build. She had been told, for most of her life, that she was too much, too large, too stubborn, too particular, too willing to see problems other people preferred not to look at. It turned out that every one of those things was exactly right for the life waiting for her on the other side of the decision to stop making herself small. Not because the world had become easier. It hadn't. The world was still full of Orson Vales and Bramwell Locks, and threatening notes slipped under doors, and men who blocked mountain roads on the assumption that a large woman traveling without a man behind her could be frightened into compliance. But she had learned through the account books, and the kitchen tables, and the federal receipt, and the needle on the floor, that the space between what people assume about you and what you actually are is not a gap you fall into. Space waits where you build. She squeezed Silas's hand. He squeezed back. The morning went on.